This question, I think, is for Mr. Mendocino. Minister, I didn't hear you thank the Ottawa Police Chief, and a lot of residents here are wondering who is in charge, and you've referenced OPP and RCMP now controlling the management of the situation. I'd like to know what's your expectation as to how they're going to manage the situation and end the blockade here, especially when there are already premiers and civil libertarians saying you have not met the threshold to trigger this act.
Well, just first with regards to Chief Slowly, I acknowledge that this is an individual who has served many years on the front lines of the public service, has crashed through many barriers in rising to the position of being a chief of police, and I think that there is an important reflection there. And as to the decision itself, as I pointed out, Tonda, that is not something that the federal government has any jurisdictional insight into. There are mechanisms that exist there within the Windsor Police Board. But what I will say is yes. I'm sorry, I meant the Ottawa Police Board. Thank you. What I will say is that the federal government is very much concerned with providing the space to have those tools, have the assets, have the personnel, so that enforcement actions can be undertaken as quickly as possible. It is not for an elected representative to put on a uniform, put on a badge, and to go onto the streets and to do that job. We rely on our law enforcement branch to do that work. The invocation of the Emergencies Act is a tool. It's a new tool that we're using. It's never been used before in the country. Now, the good news is that the framers of that statutory instrument foresaw a predicament like the one that we now find ourselves in, to afford the government some additional flexibility so that law enforcement could, for example, declare certain zones and areas that are adjacent to critical infrastructure, like borders, like our national symbols, including legislatures, like war monuments, so that people who are participating in illegal blockades, which are clearly a breach of the peace, as a no-go zone. Now, that is a very tangible tool. There have been questions that have been raised over the last number of days about whether or not police have the appropriate authorities, be it in the criminal code or in other provincial legislation. The declaration of the Emergencies Act resolves that ambiguity. In addition to that, the framers also contemplated that there would be a need to move with great rapidity to get law enforcement concrete tools like barriers, like tow trucks, like other assets, in a way that is efficient so that they can move forward with enforcement operations where are appropriate. But I want to draw a bright line about what the role of the government here is and what the role of police is. And the role of police is to now utilize those tools in a way that is obviously respectful of the Charter, in concert with provincial and municipal authorities, not in conflict with them, so that we can restore public order. No one wants to see another weekend like the last three on Wellington Street. And I'm assured by my discussions with the police that they fully appreciate that. And we now depend on them to do the job.
You have not set out publicly what zones are specifically designated as no-go zones. If you could clarify if that's something you're leaving to police to do, and why are you using essentially language that's in the Terrorism Act to describe the context for enforcement measures? You described in the declaration political and ideological objectives of protesters. Why are you using that?
Well, that's actually a very important question, and I think it cuts right to the core of what we're confronted with in this moment. There have been those who have tried to characterize these illegal blockades about vaccines and mandates and fatigue with the pandemic. That is not what is driving this movement right now. What is driving this movement is a very small, organized group that is driven by an ideology to overthrow the government through whatever means they may wish to use. And yesterday's arrests in Coots should be a cautionary tale about what it is that we are precisely dealing with here. The seizure of a significant number of illegal firearms by a group that is very committed to the cause is something that we need to be very sober about. Now, as absurd and as outlandish as the claims may be of this group, one only has to survey the damage that has been caused over the last number of weeks to our economy as a result of the interruption of the flow of our supply chains, but equally here in Ottawa. Again, like, you can't overstate what people who live here in Ottawa have had to go through. People who live in Ottawa do not feel safe right now. They don't feel safe to leave their homes. They don't feel safe to walk their streets. They don't feel safe to drop off their kids. They don't feel safe to go to work. And they certainly don't feel safe to go on Wellington Street on the weekend. And that's just simply unacceptable. Now, the good news is that the Emergencies Act contemplated this kind of a moment, and we've now reached deep into the legislative toolbox, yes, carefully and deliberately, to give those additional resources to police so that they can act quickly, and that is certainly our hope that they do that.
Just before we take the next question of programming, note the rules we have here, we split time between inside and outside. So after this question, I will have to give a block of time to people outside the room. Go ahead, thank you.
Gray from CTV. My question's for Minister Mendicino. Yesterday, after the Prime Minister announced, and you were at the press conference, that the Emergency Act was brought into place, I went down to Wellington and I talked to a bunch of truckers. They said, hey, the Prime Minister just announced that you might lose your insurance, they could take your truck, they could freeze your bank account. Pretty much everyone laughed in my face, said, I don't care, I'm not going to change my mind, we're not going to move. Is it the government's position that there is an expectation that force will need to be used to remove at least some of the truckers who are on Wellington and the other streets in Ottawa?
Short answer is we certainly hope not. And the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the declaration that follows with it sends a very powerful message and hopefully a deterrent to rational and fair-minded individuals who may think that they're just participating in a peaceful protest, but are actually now commingled with something that is much more nefarious. And, for those that, are seeking confrontation and or violence, we rely on our law enforcement to use their best judgment on how to resolve that conflict. Of course, we want the illegal blockades to be resolved peacefully. I mean, that is obviously the first preference here. And I know that police services at every level dispatch any number of tactics and techniques which are within their domain of expertise to do just that. And thus far, we have been very fortunate in that there has not been any mass outbreak of violence. And that's the way we want it to stay. So to anybody who's in the illegal blockades and who thinks that this is simply a peaceful assembly, there are any number of clear signals from the government that now is the time to go home. And of course, if people are not being motivated, and one would think that the additional powers that are introduced under the Emergencies Act around seizing proceeds and funds, which is, I think, an instrument that we'll be working very closely with the banks and financial institutions to operationalize, then here again, we will depend on police to do the job, to do it responsibly, to do it within the parameters of the law and the charter, and to do it in a way that is as peaceful as possible.
You mentioned that there's an ideology by the people who are here in Ottawa to overthrow the government. And when you combine that with the fact that we've seen that there were a number of guns seized by the RCMP in Coots, is it also your expectation that the trucks out in Wellington and around Ottawa would have guns in them as well?
Look, we, for an assessment of that, have to rely on law enforcement. I don't want to speculate about what may or may not be in possession of those who are participating in the illegal blockades. And this gets back to what Tondo was asking earlier about who's responsible for what. What elected representatives in governments are responsible for are to give police the tools that are necessary. And yesterday's invocation of the Emergencies Act is another tool. But in terms of operationalizing those laws, making them real on the streets, that's the job of the police. That's the job of those who put on the uniform and the badge. And that's why we are, depending on them to restore public safety in the most responsible and professional manner that they can, as quickly and as peacefully as possible.
Okay, we're going to turn to some calls from outside the room now. I'd like to start with Melanie Marquis, La Presse, followed by David Thurton, CBC. Melanie, your line should be opening. À vous la parole.
The floor is yours. Yes, my question is directed at Minister Duclos. Point of clarification regarding the travel health notice. You said it'll be moving from level 3 to level 2. I just wanted to clarify that that will be from the 28th of February. Moreover, why wait 2 weeks before easing these restrictions? What's the scientific basis for that 2-week delay? Response. Well, to clarify, yes, it's the 28th of February is a Monday, so it's the evening of the Sunday, the 28th of February, that these changes will come into effect. Secondly, the travel health notice is going from level 3 to level 2. Level 3 was discouraging all non-essential travel. Level 2 is inviting Canadians to exercise prudence when they consider travel abroad. Now, you can break that down in 2 ways. First, to consider the situation, the state of affairs in their destination country, to get information about the conditions they may find themselves in based on the destination country, and also the conditions here back in Canada. Second consideration, why the 28th of February? Well, obviously, the ArriveCan app needs to be updated. It needs to be properly programmed so that everything can be properly rolled out. Follow-up. Well, if I've understood correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is more of a planning issue out on the ground rather than epidemiological problems or difficulties to do with this. Minister Mendicino, I'd like to hear your reaction to the fact that the Ottawa Chief of Police has stepped down. Did the government put pressure on him to leave? And do you believe that this will enable us to turn the page and open a new chapter as far as this occupation of Ottawa is concerned? Response. Absolutely not. There was no pressure brought to bear by the government on the decision of the Chief of Police in Ottawa. It's a decision of a personal nature, from what I understand, and I wish to acknowledge Chief Slowly's hard work over decades on the front lines of the police services and law enforcement. Now, our focus in the federal government is to put all necessary resources at the disposal of law enforcement so that they can move ahead with an integrated operation to restore good order and public safety in the streets of Ottawa so that all Ottawa residents can once again find peace. This is an unacceptable state of affairs, and that is our focus going forward.
David Thurton, CBC.
Minister Mendicino, you said it in French there, if I understood you correctly. You understand that Chief Slowly's resignation was personal. What do you mean by that?
My understanding is that this was a resignation. I would just point out that, to be clear, that the federal government had no role in the decision, and that there are obviously, relationships that exist between Chief Slowly and the Ottawa Police Board that are beyond the remit of the federal government here. Our focus is to continue to give the Ottawa Police Service, the Ontario Provincial Police, and the RCMP all of the resources that they need to restore public order in the streets of Ottawa. And certainly the integrated central command unit, which has now been set up, does allow for those tools to be used in a very focused manner. And I also said in French that the situation here in Ottawa has been acceptable for quite some time, and it's our hope that public order will be restored as quickly as possible.
Okay, but the chief of police force in the capital city just resigned. And you could forgive people not only in Ottawa, but in the country who feel like no one's leading the ship here. So it doesn't really matter which jurisdictional level of government is speaking here. I think people just want clarity, assurance. Can you tell us, as much as you know, what you know about the reason Slowly resigned? You said it's for personal reasons. I think you need to say something more than that.
No, I just want to be clear. The decision was taken by Chief Slowly, completely independent from the federal government. And obviously those are questions that will be put to Chief Slowly. Our focus is to provide tools and resources to the police so that they can do the job of restoring public safety. And that is our focus. And yesterday's declaration of the Emergencies Act, which was an unprecedented moment in our country's history, was another way in which we could make available to the disposal of the Ottawa Police Service, the OPP, and the RCMP all of the things that they need. Be it the ability to declare certain zones as being prohibited from public assembly, the ability to commandeer assets like tow trucks, like barriers, be it the ability to dispatch RCMP officers to quickly enforce municipal and provincial legislation, and yes, as well, empowering banks and financial institutions to put a stop to the flow of proceeds that could advance the illegal blockades as quickly as possible, all of which, of course, being within the parameters of the law and the charter. And we'll continue to do what we can to give police those tools. But we trust them to restore public safety. I mean, to your point, yes, you're right. People don't want to hear about jurisdiction. They're not interested in the nuances. What I think people in Ottawa expect and have every right to see happen is that public order will be restored as soon as possible.
Okay, let's turn now to Marika Walsh and then Bourse pour Le Devoir. Marika.
Hi there. Thanks very much for taking our questions. Mr. Mendicino, my questions are also for you. First, on your comments that I believe you said something along the lines of nobody wants to see a repeat of the last 3 weeks and the police appreciate that. So what guarantees can you give Ottawa residents that things will change? How quickly will they change? And how are you able to ensure that there is not a repeat, given that it's Tuesday, we've lost today, there's no police chief, and there's a long weekend coming up, and we know more protesters will come?
Well, I think that's a very fair question. And all I can assure you and to everybody who's watching is that we have conveyed the concerns of the community here in Ottawa. And we've done it in a way that is honest and direct. We have expressed the degree of anxiety, the concerns. And these are not just images on social media. I know there's a lot of traffic over the course of the last 3 weeks. We're talking about people's lives. And so our job in government is to ensure that law enforcement understands and appreciates exactly what the community is feeling. The conversations that we've had, particularly with my colleagues who work in our government, Minister Fortier and MP Nakfi, have been extremely vocal, as has been all of the MPs who are members of the NCR caucus. I want to be clear, not only in Ottawa, but also in the Gatineau region. And our job is to make sure that police understand that anxiety. And from the exchanges that I've had with the commissioner, I believe that the RCMP understand it. And I know that they're working day and night to be sure that there is an operation that will be put into effect to restore public order. It isn't easy. The illegal blockade has now become entrenched in the downtown core over the last 3 weeks. You see trucks on Wellington Street. You see other structures. You see fireworks going off. You see barriers that have been toppled. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But the point that I would just make is that, from my conversations with law enforcement at the federal level, that they understand that challenge and are going to work day and night to make sure that there isn't a repeat.
Thank you for that response. And going to another comment that I've heard repeatedly from yourself and your colleagues, the government keeps pointing to the situation in Coots as a justification or one of the justifications for the Emergencies Act being invoked. But the police were able to deal with circumstances in Coots without the Emergencies Act. So why is it that we need the Emergencies Act if police in Windsor and in Alberta were able to do their job and to enforce public order and bring an end to these blockades without the act in place?
Well, first, I want to acknowledge the exceptional work of the RCMP, not only in Coots, but in British Columbia and in Surrey, as well as in Windsor, to restore public order and remove those illegal blockades so that we can get trade moving again. I mean, the devastation that was caused as a result of the obstructions to those who are participating in the illegal blockades is very deep, and it needs to be turned around. But as I explained yesterday, we can't take for granted the gains that have been made by law enforcement using existing authorities. And one of the rationales for invoking the Emergencies Act is so that we can put into effect additional tools to prevent another illegal blockade from occurring. And here I'm thinking about, Windsor in particular, and making sure that the Ambassador Bridge remains open, putting our hands on the additional barriers and tow trucks that are needed to keep flow moving as much as possible. So, yes, you're right. There have been a number of arrests and seizures that have been made with pre-existing authorities, but we don't want it to occur again. And that's why the measures which we have introduced under the Emergencies Act, which are temporary, they're targeted, they're geographically specific, and they are intended to operate in concert with pre-existing provincial authorities, including where the RCMP are the police of jurisdiction, is a way in which we think we can hold on to the gains that we have made and keep the borders and the bridges open and our national symbols safe.
Nous avons boss pour
Le devoir.
have question period, but let's start with the question on the phone here.
Bonjour,
My first question is for Minister Duclos. I have the data before my very eyes. On the 29th of January, 35% of PCR tests at the border turned out to be positive. So if my math is right, in an aeroplane, if you look around you, 1 out of every 10 passengers is likely to be infected with COVID-19. So here's what I'd like to know from you. Are you throwing in the towel when it comes to avoiding importing new variants into Canada? That was your main rationale for keeping the test in place. Response. Well, thank you for your question. Indeed, we need to continue to exercise vigilance and prudence, particularly so at the border. And what we were waiting to see was a drop in this positivity rate. And based on the most recent estimates that date back to late January, well, we waited now till mid-February, and it is our belief that in the upcoming weeks, even though it'll take some time for this data to flow through, we expect an improvement in the situation. That doesn't mean that travelling will be without risk. What it means is that we'll continue to invite Canadians to exercise prudence, to continue to be smart when they think about travelling abroad. So moving from level 3 to level 2 of this travel health notice or travel advisory doesn't mean that travel is without risk henceforth, or that when coming back to Canada, you don't need to be careful also. So that's why we see the usefulness of multiple layers of protection. There's a pre-departure layer. We still have that layer of protection in place, even though the mandatory testing is no longer responsible. This will protect Canadians and those that they rub shoulders with over the course of their travel. Follow-up question for your colleague, Minister Mendicino. The Prime Minister confirmed yesterday that this Emergencies Act would not be applied across Canada, but only where and when necessary, and in collaboration with provincial and territorial law enforcement. So here's my question. Will the federal government be using these measures under the Emergency Act, foisting them on provinces and territories that aren't interested in it, like Manitoba and Alberta, for example?
Je pense que vous avez...
Response. Well, I think you've laid things out very clearly here. That is how the Emergency Act will be rolled out on the ground across Canada. There are tools under this Act that are novel, that will be able to be used across very specific geographical regions. Now, the most important thing and useful thing to retain here is that the tools under this Act will be used in collaboration with the law enforcement in the provinces and territories. That is one thing that the Prime Minister underscored when he spoke to all of the provincial premiers, provincial and territorial premiers. This will be done in cooperation with the law enforcement, with their federal, provincial, territorial and municipal counterparts.
Ministers, thank you. Merci. I know you have to get to question period. I'd also observe there's one reporter here who might be able to squeeze something in, but I realize you have to walk through the trucks across the street to QP. So thank you very much for your time. Merci, miigwech.
Recording stopped.
Thank you. The conference is now ended.